Hey guys, welcome back. Andrew here with Ambient Endeavors, and welcome to the other side of the studio here. I've been spending the last couple weeks doing some organizing and tidying, adding some pedal shelves to the walls, putting some sound treatment up, and it's just feeling really cozy in here, and I thought I'd just take that opportunity to give a little bit different of a vantage for this video and perhaps some into the future. We're still getting it dialed in and kind of getting it to feel and sound the best as we can, but I wanted to sort of invite you into the other part of the studio here and mix things up with a little bit of a fresh look. My family's also in the midst of moving houses here in town, and so the last few weeks have just been kind of inundated with long days of getting that process moving, and honestly it's been kind of hard to find time and energy and motivation to focus in on creative work, and so this video kind of marks a re-entry back into YouTube after a few weeks off. So I really appreciate the support and for you checking back in after a little bit of a break here. This platform is kind of a fickle thing where it sort of needs to be fed constantly, and so anytime there's a break in that rhythm for me, I usually feel it with engagement, with views and things, and so I really appreciate those that have kind of stuck around and continue to support this channel here. If you're new to the channel, I'd love it if you hit subscribe below, if you drop a comment to engage with the gear we're talking about or just the conversation that we're having here in any way. I love doing that too. Today we're taking a look at the Twilight Pulse Audioworks Konstante. It made a bit of a splash in kind of the boutique overdrive conversation a handful of months ago, and I've been offering it at my shop, Little Box Effects, in this exclusive colorway with the turquoise aesthetic over white, along with a few other of the Twilight Pulse standard offerings. And so if you're in the market for this specific pedal, or if you're shopping for a new overdrive for your board, please go check out Little Box and shop one of the offerings from Twilight Pulse here. But we're going to dive into just the sounds and the features of this pedal. I think it's a fun addition to that overdrive conversation for a few reasons, and we'll get into that here in a second. First off, the core of the Konstante is a 2-in-1 circuit featuring on the left hand side here an overdrive that's in both ways familiar but nicely refined from some of the classic transparent low gain overdrives that have been on the market for a while. And then on the right hand side here you have a foot switchable EP style boost that again isn't new to anyone, but does add some really nice flavor and versatility, and pairs really well with the overdrive side. And so I love the way that Kit from Twilight Pulse has kind of packaged this pedal. It's economical, it's compact, and it can really do a lot for what it is. The control set is as you'd expect for a drive like this. On the right, you've got a single volume control for that preamp circuit, and then on the left, you have a loud and a gain control for volume and gain, as well as a frequency control to adjust the EQ of the circuit. There's a really nice range to all three of these knobs, whether you're wanting to just add a little bit of texture to your signal, whether you're wanting to crank that frequency knob and get some really bright kind of edgy tones, or dial it back for some warmer, fuller sounds. You can get all of those in the Konstante. When I was first coming up in guitar and getting into gear, the buzzword transparent overdrive was really pretty forefront in the gear conversation. Things like the Timmy, later on pedals like the Lightspeed and others kind of followed on in this lineage of overdrives that didn't add a lot of coloration. It stayed pretty flat, but just gave you some texture, some volume, and some gain oomph to send into your amp. They were really popular for a time, and I feel like that popularity has kind of ebbed and flowed a little bit. But what I'm realizing as I've come back to a pedal like Konstante is there's a real beauty in these transparent style drives and their ability to work with a great tube amp to give you kind of the most from them, to be able to kind of adjust the volume and the gain in ways that give you different stages of overdrive, kind of gain staging, if you think about it that way. And especially with the boost and the overdrive, you get an added layer of that gain staging ability with Konstante. And I was really kind of leaning into that as I've been playing this pedal. I'm running it through a newer amp, the Divided by 13 FTR 37, which is a really serious amp. that kind of has its own thing going on, and the Konstante paired really well with that amp because it could simply push it into saturation if I wanted to kind of slam the front end of that amp. It could add a little bit of nuance and sparkle or warmth to the tones if I use the EP boost, and it could really kind of get some thicker mid to higher gain textures when everything was kind of cranked and cascading into each other in the different gain stages. And so there's a number of different things you can do with just this one pedal as your gain apparatus, if you will, to run into your favorite tube amp and kind of maximize the different types of textures and tones you can get. For me, I find that the boost side can work really well for a couple different purposes. Sometimes I like to just run a boost as an always on that adds a little bit of the character of the voicing of the boost to your signal. In this case, you get a little bit of warmth. You get that kind of tape-like preamp texture, and you can nudge your volume a little bit to just kind of add a little bit of life to your cleaner sounds. You can also use it after your overdrive circuit by flipping this middle toggle here, and that can act as a simple volume boost to kind of accentuate or bring out or elevate your lead sounds or your kind of overdriven sounds that you've already got going without manipulating too much of the saturation characteristic. And then as I think about the overdrive side of the Konstante, it works really, really well for a low gain overdrive, a mid gain overdrive. You can kind of dial it in with those three controls, gain, volume, and EQ, to kind of match or work with the guitar that you're using. And it just adds that nice kind of foundational element of saturation and breakup to your playing. You can also dial the gain up to max and really get a full, rich mid-gain plus overdrive sound. So there's a fair amount of gain on tap. And overall, the overdrive just feels a little bit more refined, a little bit more rounded off without being too warm or too dark by any means. But sometimes with transparent overdrives like this, I've noticed that there's just kind of a stiffness and an edginess and a brightness to it that almost borders on shrill or kind of abrasive, where the Konstante, you really kind of have a little bit of that rounded out. You get a smoother, richer texture, especially as you go higher up in the overdrive and the saturation settings there. So really nicely voiced overdrive, some really nice features in a compact form here, and you could use this as your main or only tool in your drive section and go a long way. We're going to do that here with some sound samples. We're going to run it at the front of the board into a Strymon Volante and Flint for a little bit of wet effects at times, and then running it onto that divided by 13 FTR 37 on the American kind of Fender-y side, and just kind of see how the Konstante interacts with that type of tube amp to accentuate, to kind of push into saturation, and just to kind of allow it to bloom and just kind of interact with your foundational guitar tone that you've got going. I'm going to be playing a Fano GF6 with Lawler Regal wide range humbuckers, so those kind of lean a little bit warmer, and we're going to see how the Konstante pairs with that and the rest of the signal. Thanks again for watching. Check out the sounds coming up here, and go check out Little Box Effects via the link in the description if you're looking to pick one of these up. They're in stock now.